The silence inside the glass and steel headquarters of Aero Vanguard Global was absolute, heavy with the weight of an impending collapse. It was Christmas Eve in Fort Worth, Texas, and a brutal winter storm had buried the tarmac outside under 3 inches of ice. On the 52nd floor, the expansive executive suite was completely dark, save for the pale blue glow of a single laptop screen. Victoria Hale sat at the head of the polished mahogany conference table. Her elegant silhouette was tense, her eyes closed as she rested her forehead against her interlaced fingers. Next to her right hand lay a heavy bound document, a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, already vetted by her legal team, lacking only her signature. How had a multi-billion-dollar aerospace empire reached the brink of ruin in less than a year? The answer was simple, yet devastating. Aero Vanguard Global had just lost 3 consecutive classified military defense contracts to its chief competitor, Hexagon Defense Systems. The margins of defeat were impossibly narrow, suggesting that Hexagon knew Aero Vanguard's proprietary flight telemetry and pricing models before the bids were even submitted. Just hours earlier, the atmosphere in this very room had been toxic. During an emergency executive session, Chief Operating Officer Andrew Lockwood had stood before the board, his voice dripping with calculated panic as he demanded a total restructuring. When the door had accidentally opened, revealing the humble night shift custodian, Michael Carter, Andrew had unleashed his frustration. "Get out of here," Andrew had snapped, deliberately knocking a tray of coffee mugs to the floor, sending dark liquid splashing across Michael's worn work boots. "Learn your place and clean this up. You are a distraction we cannot afford." The room had gone silent. The board members looked away, uncomfortable but indifferent. Victoria had watched from the head of the table, her face an icy mask, too consumed by her company's imminent destruction to intervene. But Michael hadn't flinched. He didn't yell, and he didn't apologize. He simply stood at his full height, his broad shoulders squared, meeting Andrew's arrogant gaze with a steady, unbothered calm that felt strangely dangerous. Now, in the middle of the night, Victoria wanted to know if a single shred of integrity remained in her building. She had left her laptop open, displaying the internal security access logs, and intentionally lowered her head to simulate sleep. She waited to see who would enter. At 1:14 a.m., the executive elevator chimed. The slow, rhythmic squeak of a janitorial cart echoed down the hallway. Michael Carter walked into the suite, guided by the dim light of the city below. To the executives who bypassed him daily, Michael was merely a shadow in a gray uniform. They didn't know his story. They didn't know that 10 years ago, Commander Michael Carter was a decorated Navy fighter pilot and one of the brilliant minds behind the military's advanced avionics frameworks. He possessed an elite understanding of complex systems. But when his wife Claire passed away after a brutal battle with illness, Michael threw away his career in the skies. He needed a life where he could be completely present for his 7-year-old daughter, Emma. The night shift allowed him to do just that, earn a steady living and be home every single morning to cook breakfast before Emma woke up. Michael stopped his cart near the credenza, his movements completely silent. He began to replace the wastebasket liner, his eyes scanning the room. They fell upon Victoria, who appeared deeply asleep at the table. Then, his eyes drifted to the open laptop screen. The access logs were scrolling through data automatically. To an ordinary observer, it was a meaningless wall of text and timestamps. But Michael's tactical mind processed the information in a fraction of a second. He noticed a highly coordinated pattern. Someone using Andrew Lockwood's administrative credentials had been remotely exporting encrypted flight control telemetry files every Tuesday and Thursday between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Michael stood perfectly still, the trash liner hanging from his hand. This wasn't an executive catching up on late-night work. This was a systematic, calculated exfiltration of classified defense data. The company wasn't failing because of bad luck. It was being systematically drained from the inside. He looked at the bankruptcy papers resting beside Victoria's hand. If she signed that document, thousands of innocent mechanics, engineers, and ground crew workers would lose their livelihoods right after the holidays. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't touch the laptop mouse or alter any files, ensuring the digital chain of custody remained pure. He carefully angled his phone and snapped a crystal-clear photograph of the server logs and the matching timestamps. The sharp, metallic click of the phone camera echoed through the silent conference room. Michael froze. Before he could lower his arm, a voice cut through the darkness, cold and sharp. "What do you think you are doing?" Victoria Hale sat perfectly upright, her piercing gaze locked directly onto him. Michael did not lower his phone immediately. He let his arm drop slowly, his fingers wrapping around the device with a deliberate, steady grip. He looked at Victoria Hale. The high-backed leather chair framed her like a throne, but up close, beneath the sharp angles of her perfectly tailored suit, Michael saw the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the slight tremor in her right hand, the one hovering just inches from the bankruptcy document. "I asked you a question," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that usually sent senior vice presidents scrambling for excuses. "Why are you taking photos of my personal computer?" Michael placed his phone face down on his janitorial cart. He didn't stammer. He didn't offer a frantic apology. He stood in the dim blue light, his posture perfectly relaxed, yet radiating a quiet, unyielding authority. "I wasn't photographing your personal computer, Miss Hale," Michael said, his voice deep and entirely lacking the subservient tone she expected. "I was documenting a crime." Victoria scoffed, leaning back, though her muscles tightened. "A crime? You're a custodian. You empty trash cans and wax floors. If you think making up stories will save you from being fired and prosecuted for corporate espionage, you are severely mistaken." "The files being pulled on that screen," Michael said, pointing a calm finger toward the monitor without moving an inch closer, "are entering an external server through a mirrored extraction script. Look at the timestamps. Tuesday and Thursday nights, exactly at 2:14 a.m. Every transfer takes exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. No human executive sits at a keyboard and manually downloads encrypted flight telemetry on a precise, automated loop. Someone wrote an automated harvesting tool using Mr. Lockwood's credentials." Victoria froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked from Michael to the screen, her mind racing. She had spent 3 hours staring at those numbers, feeling that something was wrong, but she hadn't seen the math. She hadn't seen the mechanical precision of the timing. She looked back up at the man in the gray uniform. His eyes were steady, completely devoid of fear. "How do you know what an extraction script looks like?" she asked, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a sudden, creeping vulnerability. "I know how systems fail," Michael replied quietly. "And I know what happens when people look at the top of a mountain and ignore the foundation. There are 4,000 mechanics, engineers, and assembly workers downstairs in the hangars. They've spent the last 6 months working double shifts trying to fix the aerodynamic drag on the new commercial prototypes because they think their jobs depend on it. They don't know the game is already rigged." Victoria looked down at the bankruptcy filing. The weight of her entire family legacy, the pressure of a collapsing empire, suddenly felt crushing. For months, she had been surrounded by men in $10,000 suits who smiled to her face and lied to her pockets. She was entirely alone in a fortress of deceit. Yet here, in the dead of night, a man who earned hourly wages was telling her the truth. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm the night shift," Michael said softly. He picked up his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and took hold of the handle of his cleaning cart. "I'll leave you to your work, Miss Hale. Merry Christmas." He guided the cart out of the room, the rubber wheels turning silently against the carpet, leaving Victoria alone in the dark. By 6:15 a.m., the ice storm had eased into a gray, biting dawn. Michael walked up the steps of a modest 2-story brick home in the suburbs of Fort Worth. The front porch light was still on, casting a warm yellow glow on the snow. He quieted his footsteps as he entered, hanging his heavy jacket on the hook. A small figure was already sitting at the kitchen table, her legs dangling far above the floor. Emma was wearing an oversized winter sweater, her dark hair tied into 2 messy pigtails. In front of her was a bowl of cereal, entirely soggy, and a drawing pad. "You're late, Daddy," Emma said, not looking up as she carefully colored the wing of a bird with a blue crayon. "By 7 minutes. Michael smiled, the exhaustion of the night shift instantly washing away as he walked over and kissed the top of her head. "The roads were icy, sweetheart. Did Mrs. Engel make sure you wore your thick socks?" "Yes," Emma said, finally looking up with her mother's wide, perceptive eyes. But she fell asleep on the couch, watching the news. "Daddy, are you tired?" "Never too tired for you," Michael said, pulling out a chair and sitting beside her. He looked at her worn tennis shoes sitting by the door, the left one held together by a thin strip of tape. "We're going to get those new winter boots tomorrow, the ones with the faux fur at the top." Emma's face lit up, a pure, radiant smile that made Michael's chest tighten with an intense, protective warmth. "The shiny ones?" "The shiniest," he promised, Meanwhile, back on the 52nd floor of Aero Vanguard Global, the sun had fully risen, painting the executive office in a cold, unforgiving light. Victoria Hale had not moved from her chair. She hadn't signed the bankruptcy papers. Instead, she had spent the last 4 hours pulling up the human resources database. She typed the name into the search bar, Michael Carter. The profile loaded, but as Victoria scrolled down to the background check and employment history, she stopped. Her hand began to tremble against the mouse. The screen did not show a standard employment history. Almost every single line of Michael Carter's previous 10 years was completely blocked out, replaced by bold, black lines and an official digital stamp that made her blood run cold. Restricted, depth of defense, Class 4 clearance required. Before she could process what she was looking at, her office door flew open without a knock. Andrew Lockwood strode into the room, a smug, confident smile on his face, holding a leather briefcase. "Victoria," Andrew said smoothly, stepping toward the desk. "It's 9 o'clock. The board is assembling downstairs. Are the bankruptcy papers signed, or do we need to force the vote?" Victoria slowly closed the laptop screen, her eyes locking onto the man who had spent months destroying her company, while the image of the restricted military file burned into her mind. Victoria stood up from her desk, the bankruptcy document held tightly in her hand. Andrew Lockwood watched her, his smile widening slightly, expecting her to hand it over. Instead, she walked past him toward the industrial shredder at the corner of her office. "The board can wait, Andrew," Victoria said, her voice dropping all traces of the exhaustion that had plagued her hours earlier. "I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the flight telemetry servers before any signatures touch this page." Andrew's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into slits. "An audit? Victoria, the company is bleeding $50 million a week. Hexagon Defense is preparing a hostile takeover the moment we declare bankruptcy. Delaying this by even 24 hours will destroy whatever personal assets you have left. The board will vote to remove you by noon." "Then let them vote," she replied coldly. "But until they do, I am the Chief Executive Officer of Aero Vanguard Global. Get out of my office." Andrew's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently under his groomed beard. He took a step closer, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper. "You're making a catastrophic mistake. You're letting emotion ruin your family's legacy." He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. Victoria waited 30 seconds before following him out. She needed to see the board members as they arrived, to read their faces and figure out who else was complicit in the data theft Michael had discovered. When she stepped out of the executive elevator into the soaring, glass-walled atrium of the lower lobby, the atmosphere was thick with tension. A few essential security guards and early arriving board members stood scattered around the polished marble floor. But the center of attention was near the security desk. Andrew Lockwood stood there, his face flushed with anger, pointing a sharp finger at Michael Carter. Michael was not in his uniform today. He wore a faded flannel shirt and dark jeans, holding a small canvas backpack. Next to him, sitting quietly on a sleek leather bench, was Emma. She was clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit with a missing ear, her small legs swinging nervously as she watched the loud man shout at her father. Michael had been forced to bring her in for 30 minutes to sign his holiday overtime timesheet after his elderly neighbor's plumbing burst. "This is a high-security defense contracting facility, Carter." Andrew's voice boomed across the atrium, turning the heads of 2 arriving board members. "Not a homeless shelter, not a subsidized daycare for the help. You do not bring your baggage into my lobby." "She's sitting quietly on the bench, Mr. Lockwood," Michael said. His voice was incredibly low, completely level, contrasting sharply with Andrew's frantic hostility. "We are leaving in 2 minutes." "You'll leave right now and you can stay gone," Andrew snapped. In a petty display of dominance, he swiped his hand across the edge of the security desk, intentionally striking Emma's small canvas backpack. The bag hit the marble floor, spilling a box of cheap crayons, a coloring book, and a small, cracked plastic water bottle across the pristine floor. Emma gasped, her eyes welling with sudden, terrified tears. She shrunk back against the leather bench, her lower lip trembling violently as she looked up at the angry executive. The entire lobby froze. The security guards looked down, uncomfortable. The board members watched in silence. Andrew stood tall, expecting Michael to cower, to beg for his job, or to lose his temper and give Andrew a reason to have him arrested. But Michael didn't yell. He didn't even look at Andrew. The transition in Michael's demeanor was instantaneous and terrifyingly steady. The quiet, humble janitor vanished, replaced by an overwhelming presence of absolute calm control. He knelt down on the marble floor, completely turning his back on the powerful chief operating officer. "Hey," Michael said softly, his deep voice carrying a natural warmth that immediately cut through Emma's panic. He gathered her crayons with steady, unhurried hands. "Look at me, sweetheart." Emma looked down at him, a tear escaping her cheek. "Is the rabbit okay?" Michael asked, a gentle smile touching his lips as he tapped the stuffed animal's nose. "He looks like he's ready for an adventure." Emma let out a small, watery giggle, nodding as she wiped her eyes. The sheer emotional security Michael provided in that moment was profound. He didn't offer her money or luxury. He offered a shield of absolute safety that no amount of corporate power could buy. Victoria watched from the edge of the atrium, her heart aching with a mixture of intense respect for Michael and deep disgust for Andrew. She took a step forward, but stopped when she saw something metallic slide out from the side pocket of Michael's canvas bag as he lifted it. It was a heavy, tarnished silver coin. It rolled across the marble, stopping right at the edge of Victoria's designer heels. She looked down and picked it up. On one side, engraved in deep, sharp steel, was a striking insignia, a dual-engine fighter jet silhouette surrounded by the words United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor. Beneath it, a name was permanently etched, Commander M. Carter, Ghost. Victoria's breath hitched. A Top Gun instructor, a military legend. The restricted Department of Defense files suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Andrew, completely oblivious to the coin, sneered down at Michael. "Clean up your trash and get out of my sight before I have security throw you into the snow." "That's enough, Andrew," Victoria's voice rang out across the atrium, cold as ice and loud enough to echo off the glass ceilings. She walked directly into the center of the lobby, her eyes locked onto her COO with a lethal intensity. Andrew turned, his expression shifting into a mask of corporate concern. "Victoria, I was just handling a breach of protocol." "You are the only breach in this building," Victoria said, her voice trembling with a rare, dangerous anger. She stopped right in front of Michael, who was now standing at his full height, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken understanding. Victoria looked down at the heavy silver coin in her hand, then looked up into the eyes of the man who held the keys to saving her entire world. "Commander," she said softly, ensuring the word carried across the quiet lobby, "I think we need to talk." Andrew's face drained of color as the entire room gasped. Andrew Lockwood took a step back, a sharp, nervous laugh escaping his lips. He looked at the tarnished silver coin in Victoria's hand, then at Michael's faded flannel shirt, trying desperately to regain his footing in front of the gathering board members. "Commander?" Andrew scoffed, his voice straining for its usual patronizing pitch. "Victoria, the stress of this bankruptcy is clearly making you delusional. This man has been wiping down toilets in this building for nearly a year. He's a high school graduate who couldn't handle a real tech job. If he has a military coin, he probably stole it from a real veteran's locker." The accusation hung heavy in the air, but Michael didn't offer a defense. He simply reached out, his large, calloused hand open, and Victoria placed the heavy coin back into his palm. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the absolute stability radiating from him. Before Andrew could utter another insult, a deafening, rhythmic horn shattered the quiet of the glass atrium. The pristine white light overhead instantly shifted to a pulsing, urgent crimson. On the massive security console behind the main desk, row after row of terminal monitors began flashing with stark, black and red text. Critical avionics fault. Automated testing Hangar 4. Systems compromised. Engine speed exceeding safe margins. Override denied. Lessons. Engines. Over. The head of building security slammed his palms onto the desk, his face instantly turning pale as he stared at the cascading data. "Ma'am, the automated prototype testing rig down in Bay 4 just initiated a live high-velocity diagnostic loop. The system isn't responding to our terminal inputs. It's locked down." Victoria felt the room spin. Testing Bay 4 housed the Vanguard propulsion system, the crown jewel of the company's defense contract bid. It was a massive, experimental turbine engine currently mounted to a hydraulic pressure rig. Because of the holiday, the hangar below was running on a skeleton crew of 12 junior technicians and mechanics. "Shut it down," Victoria ordered, her corporate composure fracturing as the raw panic of physical danger took hold. "Kill the power to the entire wing! Use the emergency breakers!" "No," Andrew yelled, stepping forward, his eyes wide with a different kind of terror. If you drop the main breakers while the turbine is at maximum velocity, you'll wipe the system memory and destroy $50 million worth of proprietary hardware. Just let the internal cooling loop handle it. The cooling loop is already dead, Andrew. The security chief shouted over the blaring siren. The temperature in the turbine core is rising by 40 degrees every 10 seconds. The fuel valves are locked wide open. If it reaches critical threshold, the casing will rupture. It will take out the entire southern wing of the facility. Total chaos erupted in the lobby. Board members began frantically pushing past each other toward the emergency exits, completely abandoning any pretense of corporate dignity. The security guards froze, gripped by a terrifying helplessness. Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat. She had billions of dollars in the bank, absolute authority over a global empire, and yet, facing a lethal mechanical crisis, she was entirely powerless. She couldn't stop the machine. She couldn't save the people downstairs. Amidst the screaming and the pulsing red lights, Emma began to cry, shrinking against the leather bench and covering her ears. Michael dropped to one knee instantly. He didn't look at the flashing monitors, and he didn't join the shouting match between Victoria and Andrew. He gently took Emma's trembling hands away from her ears and held them securely within his own. "Emma, look at me," Michael said. His voice was a rock of perfect, unshakable serenity in the middle of a collapsing world. "Do you remember the storm last winter, when the power went out and the wind was loud?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear, tears streaming down her small cheeks. "What did we do?" Michael asked, his eyes projecting a deep, comforting warmth. We built a blanket fort," she whispered, her breathing slowing down as she anchored herself to his calm strength. "And we ate peanut butter sandwiches." "Exactly," Michael said, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "The noise out here is just a big wind, sweetheart. I need you to stay right here and be the bravest girl in Texas for just a few minutes. Can you do that for me?" Emma swallowed hard and nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. Michael stood up and turned around. The transformation was complete. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by the lethal, hyper-focused gaze of a military commander on a flight deck. He stepped directly up to the chaotic security console, ignoring Andrew completely, and gripped the edge of the desk. "Listen to me," Michael commanded. The sheer authority in his voice was so absolute that the security chief and Victoria instantly stopped talking, turning to look at him. "Do not touch the main breakers. Andrew is wrong about the hardware, but if you cut the power completely, the magnetic containment seals will collapse instantly. The turbine blades will shred the casing and turn that entire hangar into a fragmentation grenade." Andrew sneered, though his voice shook. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're a janitor." Michael didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Victoria. "The remote extraction script Hexagon planted didn't just steal your data, Miss Hale. It was a Trojan horse. They injected a malicious command override into the fuel injection matrix to trigger a catastrophic failure today. They wanted to ensure your asset valuation dropped to zero before the board meeting." Victoria stared at him, her hands trembling. "Can we stop it?" "Not from here," Michael said, his eyes scanning the flashing error codes. "The network bridge is flooded. The only way to kill the sequence is to manually bleed the pressure lines directly from the manual manifold inside the testing bay itself." The security chief gasped. "The bay is pressurized. The heat in there right now must be unbearable. It's suicide to walk onto that floor." Michael adjusted the straps of his canvas backpack, his face an unreadable mask of absolute, quiet masculinity. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a reward or demand a contract. He simply moved toward the secure elevator that led directly down to the testing hangars. "Michael, wait!" Victoria called out, her voice cracking with a vulnerability she had never allowed anyone to see. She took 2 fast steps toward him, completely forgetting her status, her pride, her company. "You can't go down there alone." Michael paused at the elevator threshold, the red emergency lights painting his silhouette in sharp, dramatic shadows. He looked back at her, his gaze shifting briefly to Emma sitting bravely on the bench, then back to Victoria. "Keep an eye on my daughter, Victoria," Michael said quietly, using her first name for the very first time. "I'm going to go turn off the wind." The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, descending directly into the heart of the crisis. The heavy steel blast doors of Testing Bay 4 hissed open, releasing a wave of dry, suffocating heat that hit Michael like a physical wall. The roar of the experimental turbine engine was deafening, a high-pitched, screaming whine that vibrated through the concrete floor and deep into his chest. Red strobe lights cut through the haze of aerosolized synthetic oil. Most of the skeleton crew had already evacuated, scrambling up the emergency stairs in a panic. Only 2 junior technicians remained near the primary blast shield, their hands shaking as they uselessly punched keys on a completely locked terminal. "Get out!" Michael's voice carried over the mechanical scream, forged by years of commanding chaotic flight decks. "Take the northern exit, now!" The young technicians didn't argue. They looked at the intense, steady older man who had suddenly appeared in the middle of their nightmare, and they ran. 52 floors above, Victoria stood directly in front of the leather bench where Emma sat. The sirens continued to wail, casting their rhythmic crimson pulse across the glass walls of the atrium. Andrew Lockwood was on his phone at the edge of the lobby, his voice low and furious as he argued with someone. "The virus wasn't supposed to trigger until January. You've ruined the entire timeline." He slammed his phone shut and began walking toward the private executive exit, clutching his briefcase. "Where do you think you're going, Andrew?" Victoria's voice cut through the noise. "I'm securing my own safety, Victoria," Andrew sneered, his mask of corporate professionalism completely shattered. "This company is dead. The building is compromised. If you want to die for a broken family legacy, be my guest. But I'm leaving." He didn't care about the thousands of employees. He didn't care about the facility. Victoria felt a cold realization wash over her. Power, money, status, none of it meant anything when the world was burning. She looked down at Emma. The little girl was trembling, her tiny fingers turning white as she squeezed her stuffed rabbit. Victoria, a woman who had spent her entire life negotiating cold boardroom deals and shutting down emotional vulnerability, slowly sat down on the leather bench. She had never been a mother. She didn't know how to comfort a child. But she reached out her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently placed it over Emma's shoulder. "He's going to be okay," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time in 10 years she had allowed herself to feel something raw and unguided. "Your dad. He's the bravest man I've ever met." Emma looked up, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto Victoria's. "My dad doesn't get scared of machines. He says they only do what people tell them to do, but someone told this one to be mean." The words pierced Victoria's chest. Andrew Lockwood had sold out their safety for a line item on a competitor's balance sheet. Deep inside Testing Bay 4, the heat had risen to an agonizing 130 degrees. Michael shed his heavy flannel shirt, revealing a dark gray t-shirt soaked in sweat, his lean, muscular frame bearing the faded scars of his military career. He moved with fluid, calculated precision. The massive turbine engine was spinning at an impossible 40,000 RPM, its titanium housing glowing a dull, dangerous cherry red. The automated fuel lines were feeding the fire at a relentless rate. Michael reached the central control manifold, a heavy steel station protected by a thick, reinforced plexiglass shield. The digital touchscreen interface was dead, flashing a single, mocking message. "Encrypted, override, required. Hexagon core secure." Michael didn't panic. He knelt below the digital terminal, tearing open the heavy metal maintenance access panel with his bare hands, ignoring the sharp edge of the steel that sliced his palm. He knew the secondary analog infrastructure of this specific turbine framework. He had helped review the foundational blueprints for the Department of Defense before the technology was privatized. Inside the panel sat the heavy, mechanical brass wheel valves, the manual fuel bleed lines. They were designed to bypass the digital operating system completely in the event of an electrical failure, but they were locked in place by an automated mechanical pin controlled by the corrupted software. Michael grabbed a heavy iron wrench from a nearby tool rack. The heat was becoming blinding, making his vision blur. He had less than 60 seconds before the internal thermal limits of the turbine casing failed. He jammed the wrench into the mechanical locking pin assembly, using his entire body weight to force the metal lever downward. Upstairs, the main security console emitted a sharp, erratic beep. The temperature gauge in the turbine core had just crossed the critical red line. "It's over," the security chief whispered, stepping back from the desk. "The casing is going to blow." Andrew Lockwood had reached the glass double doors of the main exit, his hand on the handle, a coward escaping the wreckage. Suddenly, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the PA system from the hangar below, followed by a sound like a rushing jet stream. On the main monitor, the automated fuel pressure numbers began to fluctuate wildly, dropping from 98% down to 70. "He did it," Victoria gasped, her grip tightening on Emma's hand. "He's forcing the fuel out." "No, look at the telemetry," the security chief shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the secondary readout. "The digital Trojan horse is fighting back. It's rerouting the emergency backup fuel into the secondary intake to compensate for the manual bleed. The engine is accelerating again." Down in the bay, Michael felt the rush of hot air change frequency, shifting from a roar to a deafening, high-pitched scream. The wrench in his hand vibrated violently. The digital screen above the manual manifold flashed a new, terrifying countdown. System purge failure. Critical detonation in 30 seconds. To stop the secondary intake, Michael had to physically hold the heavy manual lever down with his own hands, keeping the valve open while the pressure built. If he let go for even a single second, the system would lock completely. But if he stayed, he would be standing less than 5 feet from the turbine when the internal emergency release valve blew its high-pressure thermal exhaust. His phone rang inside his pocket. It was the internal security patch from the lobby desk. Victoria's voice came through the speaker, frantic, raw, and completely devoid of her usual cold corporate armor. "Michael, get out of there. The backup system has bypassed your override. You have 30 seconds before the casing ruptures. You have to leave." Michael held the heavy iron lever with both hands, his muscles straining, his boots sliding against the slick concrete floor as the pressure pushed against him. He looked at the glowing red metal of the turbine housing just meters away. "I can't leave, Victoria," Michael said, his voice incredibly quiet, completely steady over the roaring chaos. "If I let go of this lever, the blast will tear through the structural supports of the lower lobby. My daughter is sitting right above me." "Michael, please." Victoria cried out, her voice breaking into a sob as she held Emma close to her chest upstairs. "Tell Emma I love her," Michael said softly. "And Victoria, do not let Andrew Lockwood leave this building." The countdown on the screen hit 15 seconds. The sound became blinding. The countdown on the digital terminal flashed single digits. 9, 8, 7. Deep inside the suffocating heat of Testing Bay 4, Michael Carter did not close his eyes. His boots melted slightly against the scorching concrete floor, and his hands rawly gripped the iron wrench locked against the mechanical lever. The secondary intake valve was fighting his physical strength, pulsing violently as the corrupted Hexagon software tried to force a catastrophic fuel surge. Michael looked at the glowing cherry-red turbine casing. He knew the physics of the machine. He knew that when the thermal exhaust burst, it would expand outward in a lethal cone. With 5 seconds remaining, Michael didn't run. Instead, he reached past the dead digital terminal, his bleeding right hand grabbing a heavily shielded, manual overhead lever marked Emergency Counter-Torque Fluidic Brake. This was a non-digital, emergency electromagnetic retarder tied directly to the structural drive shaft, a redundant military-spec safeguard designed to halt weaponized propulsion systems without relying on software network commands. He threw his entire body weight into the lever. A deafening, low-frequency hum vibrated through the steel deck as massive magnetic fields engaged against the spinning core, fighting the 40,000 revolutions per minute's momentum. Sparks erupted in a brilliant, blinding shower from the underlying containment rings as the massive counter-torque forced the turbine to decelerate. The mechanical scream shifted violently down the octaves, grinding from a high-pitched shriek into a heavy metallic groan before the blades finally locked safely into a dead stop. The immediate danger of a fragmentation blowout vanished, leaving the bay in absolute, echoing silence. Upstairs, in the 52nd floor atrium, the pulsing crimson emergency lights abruptly clicked off. The piercing sirens stopped mid-wail, replaced by the humming return of the standard white office lights. On the primary security monitor, the red error codes vanished, replaced by a single line of green text. Core stabilized. Emergency PN pneumatic purge complete. Victoria let out a ragged breath she felt like she had been holding for an eternity. She looked down at Emma, who slowly uncovered her ears, her wide eyes searching Victoria's face. "He did it," Victoria whispered, a tear escaping her eye as she pulled the little girl into a tight embrace. "Your daddy stopped it." At the edge of the lobby, Andrew Lockwood had his hand on the handle of the private exit door. Seeing the lights return to normal and realizing the building wasn't going to explode, he quickly smoothed his designer jacket and turned back around, trying to regain his mask of composure. "Well," Andrew said, his voice loud as he addressed the remaining board members who were trembling near the elevators. "It seems our automated safety features functioned exactly as intended." "Victoria, This near disaster only proves that our infrastructure is unstable. We must proceed with the bankruptcy and asset liquidation immediately. Stand down, Andrew, Victoria said. Her voice was no longer that of a panicked executive. It was a lethal, unyielding blade. She stood up from the bench, keeping Emma safely behind her. Security, lock the main doors. No one leaves this floor. The security guards, who had just witnessed Andrew try to abandon them all to die, didn't hesitate. They stepped in front of the exit doors, their arms crossed, blocking Andrew's path. The executive elevator chimed. The heavy steel doors slid open, and a hush fell over the entire atrium. Michael Carter stepped out. His gray t-shirt was torn and soaked in sweat, his forearm blackened by soot. A strip of his flannel shirt was wrapped tightly around his bleeding left hand. Yet, as he walked across the polished marble floor, his posture was perfectly straight, his broad shoulders squared, radiating the immense, undeniable gravity of a commander returning from a successful mission. Emma broke away from the bench, running as fast as her small legs could carry her. Daddy. Michael dropped to his knees, catching her effortlessly with his uninjured arm, pulling her close and kissing her hair. I'm right here, sweetheart. I told you it was just a big wind. Victoria walked toward them, her eyes locked onto Michael with a profound, emotional reverence. The board members watched in stunned silence as the multi-billion-dollar CEO stopped right in front of the night shift custodian, showing a level of respect she had never granted to any global investor. Andrew stepped forward, his face twisting into a sneer of pure desperation. Victoria, surely you aren't going to let this laborer dictate company policy. He broke protocol, went into a restricted zone, and probably caused the mechanical failure himself to look like a hero. Shut up, Andrew, Victoria said, not even looking at him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy, tarnished silver coin Michael had dropped earlier. She held it high so every board member and security guard could see the deep engravings. 24 hours ago. Victoria announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority through the glass atrium. I thought our company was failing because of market shifts, but thanks to this man, I found the truth. This isn't just a custodian. This is Commander Michael Carter, former United States Navy fighter pilot and chief tactics instructor at Top Gun. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining board members. One of the older gentlemen stepped forward, his eyes wide with recognition. Commander Carter, the pilot who designed the automated defense shielding for the carrier strike groups? The Pentagon thought you retired completely from the grid. He didn't retire from the grid, Victoria said, her sharp gaze finally snapping onto Andrew Lockwood. He chose to be a father, while you, Andrew, chose to be a traitor. Andrew went entirely pale, his hand tightening around his leather briefcase. Victoria, you have no proof of these absurd accusations. I have the server logs, Andrew, Michael said calmly, standing up to his full height, holding Emma's hand securely. His deep voice carried an icy weight that completely paralyzed the room. I documented the extraction scripts. I tracked the IP addresses routed through your personal Delaware Shell Corporation directly to Hexagon Defense. And 5 minutes ago, down in the bay, I found the physical hardware bridge you installed behind the diagnostic terminal to override the manual fuel lines. Michael looked at the security guards. The data packet contains his digital signature. The federal authorities have already been notified. They are crossing the bridge right now. Andrew's briefcase slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the marble floor with a heavy hollow thud as the realization of his absolute ruin set in. The heavy glass entrance doors of the Aero Vanguard Global lobby burst open, allowing a gust of freezing Texas wind to sweep inside. A team of federal agents in dark tactical jackets stepped through the threshold, led by a sharp, unsmiling woman who flashed a gold shield. Special Agent Sarah Kincaid from the Federal Financial Crimes Division walked directly toward the center of the room, her eyes locked on Andrew Lockwood. Andrew Lockwood, Agent Kincaid said, her voice clear and chillingly official. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, theft of classified defense data, and intentional sabotage of federal infrastructure. Andrew scrambled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor. This is a misunderstanding. I am the chief operating officer of this company. You can't just barge in here based on the word of a night shift janitor. Agent Kincaid didn't argue. She nodded to the two agents behind her. Within seconds, Andrew's arms were pulled behind his back, and the sharp, definitive click of steel handcuffs echoed across the silent atrium. The heavy leather briefcase containing his stolen files was confiscated and tagged as federal evidence. As the agents began to lead him away, Andrew looked back at the board members, his eyes wild with terror. "Raymond! Thomas! Tell them! We had a plan! We were going to save the assets!" The board members completely turned their backs on him. The older gentleman who had recognized Michael earlier stepped forward, looking at Andrew with deep disgust. "You didn't want to save the assets, Andrew. You wanted to burn the house down with all of us inside it." Andrew was marched out into the snow, his high-priced career and his freedom vanishing into the back of a black government vehicle. The lobby fell into an intense, heavy silence. The board members stood clustered together, looking entirely lost. The crushing weight of the near disaster was settling in, and they all realized how close they had come to total ruin. They looked toward Victoria, waiting for her to speak, to give them direction. But Victoria wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Michael Carter. Michael stood calmly, his uninjured hand gently smoothing Emma's hair as she rested her face against his side. Despite the blood on his hands and the soot on his shirt, he looked completely unbothered by the chaos that had just unfolded. He possessed an incredible, grounded serenity that money simply could not buy. For the first time in her life, Victoria realized that her immense wealth and global power meant absolutely nothing compared to the emotional security this man carried within himself. She walked slowly over to the board members, her voice steady and absolute. "The emergency session is over. There will be no bankruptcy filing. There will be no liquidation. Go back to your hotels, review the recovery data we will send out tomorrow, and prepare for a full restructuring of our executive branch." "And the defense contract?" one of the board members asked quietly. "We will submit our flight telemetry on Monday morning, exactly as scheduled," Victoria said, her eyes shifting back to Michael, "because the core data is secure." The board members nodded silently, leaving the atrium one by one, until only Victoria, Michael, and Emma remained, surrounded by the quiet hum of the building's restored mechanical systems. Victoria walked back over to Michael, stopping just a few feet away. She looked down at his wrapped hand, where a small drop of red was beginning to seep through the makeshift flannel bandage. Without a word, she reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched his wrist. "You're bleeding, Michael," she said softly, her voice completely losing its cold corporate edge, replaced by a rare, genuine vulnerability. "It's just a scratch, Victoria," Michael replied, his voice deep and comforting. "I've had worse on standard flight decks." "Come with me to my office," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intense, unspoken gratitude. "I have a medical kit in the executive suite. Let me clean it." Michael looked down at Emma, who was looking up at Victoria with wide, curious eyes. "Can we go to the top floor, Daddy? The windows up there are really big." A gentle smile touched Michael's lips. "Only if you promise not to touch the glass, sweetheart." "I promise," Emma said, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The three of them rode the executive elevator back up to the 52nd floor in silence. The tension that had filled the air hours ago was entirely gone, replaced by a strange, peaceful intimacy. When they entered Victoria's private office, the cold mahogany table no longer felt intimidating. The morning sun was pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the Fort Worth skyline in warm gold and amber light. Victoria brought out a black first aid kit from her cabinet and sat down on the leather sofa next to Michael. She carefully unwrapped the torn piece of flannel from his hand, her touch incredibly light, as if she were afraid of hurting him. "I looked up your record this morning," Victoria whispered, keeping her eyes focused on his palm as she used an antiseptic wipe to clean the small cut. "Before the crisis happened. Your file is completely restricted by the Department of Defense." "I spent 12 years in the skies," Michael said quietly, watching her hands move with steady care. "I loved the flight telemetry. I loved the engineering. But when Claire got sick, the military didn't fit into the math anymore. Emma needed a father who was on the ground, not a ghost in the clouds." Victoria paused, her eyes welling with a sudden, deep emotion. She looked up at him, her hand still resting gently beneath his. "You gave up a legendary career to empty trash cans in my building." "I gave up a career to save my daughter," Michael corrected softly. "It wasn't a sacrifice, Victoria. It was a choice, the easiest one I've ever made." Victoria felt a sharp ache in her chest. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who sacrificed their families for careers, who chose power over love, just as Andrew Lockwood had. She had believed that guarding her emotions and living in a lonely, premium world was the only way to survive. But looking into Michael's calm, steady eyes, she realized what she had truly been missing. Emma walked over to the massive window, pressing her nose lightly against the glass as she watched a distant airplane glide through the clear morning sky. "Daddy, look, a big bird." Michael smiled, his eyes never leaving Victoria's. "That's a beautiful bird, Emma." Victoria felt her heart beat a little faster as Michael's fingers gently wrapped around hers, a silent, powerful connection growing between them in the warmth of the Christmas morning sun. 6 weeks later, the grand corporate auditorium of Aero Vanguard Global was filled to absolute capacity. The atmosphere inside the tiered theater was buzzing with an intense, nervous energy. Every single member of the board of directors sat in the front rows, flanked by the company's senior engineering teams and a high-ranking delegation from the United States Department of Defense. The emergency assembly had been called to address a final, desperate move by Hexagon Defense Systems. Just days prior, Hexagon's high-priced legal team had filed a massive federal injunction, claiming that Aero Vanguard's upcoming defense bid relied on compromised, unstable flight telemetry data. The board members were whispering frantically among themselves, terrified that the multi-billion-dollar Vanguard contract would be permanently canceled, dragging the company back to the brink of ruin. Raymond and Thomas sat near the center aisle, their expressions tight with anxiety as they checked their watches. The heavy oak side doors opened, and Victoria Hale walked out onto the main stage. She wore a sharp, tailored navy blue blazer, her presence completely commanding the room. The cold, unyielding armor she used to wear like a second coat was gone. In its place was a profound, radiant confidence that felt deeply human, yet entirely unshakable. She stepped up to the crystal podium and looked out at the sea of anxious faces. "Thank you all for coming," Victoria said, her voice clear and resonant, effortlessly cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Before we address the frivolous legal filings from Hexagon Defense, I have a major executive announcement. Over the last month, our infrastructure has undergone a total security overhaul. Today, I am officially introducing our newly appointed Executive Chief of Global Avionics and Strategic Security." Victoria turned her head toward the back of the auditorium. "Please welcome Commander Michael Carter." The heavy double doors at the top of the theater swung open. A collective breath caught in the throats of the board members. Michael Carter walked down the center aisle. He was no longer wearing a faded flannel shirt or a gray janitorial uniform. He wore a flawless, dark charcoal Italian wool suit that perfectly framed his broad, disciplined shoulders. His stride was slow, measured, and carried the undeniable, immense gravity of a military legend. Holding his right hand, walking proudly beside him, was Emma. She wore a beautiful emerald green velvet dress, and on her feet were the shiniest black winter boots, with thick, soft faux fur at the top. She looked up at the massive stage and smiled, completely secure in the warmth of her father's grip. Stunned gasps rippled through the front rows. Raymond's jaw dropped. The board members who had looked right through Michael for an entire year, the men who had watched Andrew Lockwood humiliate him in the lobby, were now staring at a man who radiated absolute authority. At the front of the stage, Admiral Marcus Vance, the decorated head of the Pentagon's Defense Procurement Division, stood up from his seat. He didn't look at Michael's expensive suit. He looked into the eyes of a brother in arms. The Admiral stepped into the aisle, squared his shoulders, and snapped a crisp, perfectly rigid military salute. "Commander Carter," Admiral Vance said, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It is an honor to see you back at the helm, Ghost." Michael stopped at the base of the stage, returned a respectful nod to the Admiral, and walked up to the podium, placing a small digital tablet onto the display dock. He looked out at the board members, his deep voice carrying an icy, level weight that instantly silenced the entire auditorium. 6 weeks ago, Hexagon Defense Systems believed they had successfully drained this company's core technology, Michael stated, his calm masculinity anchoring the room. "They believed our flight frameworks were compromised." But what Andrew Lockwood failed to realize when he installed his remote extraction tool is that a tactical system is only as blind as its operators. Michael tapped the screen, and a massive, crystal-clear digital diagram projected onto the wall behind him. The administrative data logs, Miss Hale and I analyzed on Christmas Eve, allowed me to pinpoint the exact structural path of Hexagon's mirrored extraction tool, Michael revealed, his voice level and commanding. When Miss Hale granted me emergency database root access in the early hours of Friday morning, I spent the remaining hours of the night building an undetectable, federal-level honeypot environment over our primary servers. A wave of realization washed over the engineering team. The automated payload hexagon triggered during the hangar crisis this morning didn't encrypt our actual flight code, Michael continued, a cold, knowing smile touching his lips. It was routed entirely into that sandbox architecture. They pulled a simulated, mathematically flawed telemetry profile. If Hexagon attempts to launch a prototype using that stolen data, their guidance arrays will safely lock down within 10 seconds of takeoff. Furthermore, the payload contained an embedded cryptographic tracking beacon. When their central servers compiled the download 3 hours ago, it opened a digital backdoor for the Department of Justice. As of 8:45 a.m., Hexagon's entire defense asset portfolio has been frozen, and their security clearances have been permanently revoked. Aero Vanguard Global is the sole remaining bidder. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then, Admiral Vance broke into a wide smile and began to clap. Within moments, the entire auditorium erupted into a deafening, roaring, standing ovation. The board members were shouting in celebration, engineers were cheering, and Raymond was clapping so hard his hands turned white. The very people who had underestimated the quiet single father were now looking up at him with a profound, bordering on religious respect. He had saved their livelihoods, their honor, and their entire future without ever raising his voice. Michael didn't bathe in the applause. He didn't smile at the executives. He simply stepped away from the podium and knelt down on the stage, his focus entirely shifting back to Emma. She ran into his arms, laughing happily as her shiny new boots clicked against the floor. He lifted her effortlessly, holding her close to his chest. Victoria walked over to them, stopping right beside Michael. The roaring crowd faded into the background as she looked into his eyes, her own welling with tears of pure, unadulterated love and gratitude. "You did it, Commander," she whispered, her hand gently coming to rest against his arm. "We did it, Victoria," Michael replied softly. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, the 52nd floor executive suite of Aero Vanguard Global was completely dark, save for the warm, golden glow of a towering Christmas tree covered in silver ornaments. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a soft, heavy snow was blanketed over Fort Worth, burying the tarmac in a peaceful, silent white. Emma was curled up on the long leather sofa near the tree, her head resting against a soft pillow, fast asleep. She was clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly, her shiny boots neatly placed on the rug beside her. Victoria stood by the window, a warm glass of cider pressed between her hands as she watched the snowflakes drift through the night. She looked incredibly peaceful, the crushing loneliness that had defined her life entirely washed away. Michael walked up behind her, his movements silent and steady. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, his chin resting gently near her shoulder. Victoria let out a long, contented breath, leaning back into his absolute protective warmth. 1 year ago tonight, Victoria whispered, looking at their shared reflection in the dark glass. I was sitting at that table alone, ready to sign my entire life away. I thought there wasn't a single honest person left in the world. Michael kissed the side of her neck, his hands holding hers securely. The world isn't empty, Victoria. Sometimes, you just have to wait for the night shift to clear away the dark. She turned around in his embrace, her hands sliding up his chest to wrap around his neck, looking up into the steady, warm eyes of the man who had given her a family, a home, and absolute security. Merry Christmas, Michael, she whispered. Merry Christmas, Victoria, he replied, before bending down to kiss her, while the snow continued to fall softly over the quiet, beautiful city below.